There are nights in music history that were planned down to the second, and then there are nights that slip out of every producer's hands. This was supposed to be a polished awards ceremony. Bright lights, careful applause, famous faces smiling when the cameras found them. Phil Collins had arrived expecting nothing more dangerous than handshakes, small talk, and maybe a polite walk to the stage if his name was called. But somewhere behind the velvet curtain, the night began to change. Michael Jackson was in the room too, moving with that strange quietness that made even famous people turn their heads. He carried silence like it belonged to him. Phil had lived inside fame for years. Genesis had filled arenas. His solo records had followed people into cars, kitchens, heartbreaks, and lonely bedrooms. But Michael carried a different weather around him, and Phil still had the look of a man who never completely believed he belonged in the Golden Room.
That was the thing people often missed about Phil Collins. He could make a stadium clap on beat. He could sing heartbreak so plainly that millions felt it was their own. But under the jokes, the grin, and the ordinary guy charm, there was still a drummer from London wondering how he had ended up beside giants. The cameras saw a star. Phil still felt like a working musician trying not to drop the sticks. The ceremony moved the way ceremonies move. Names were read, envelopes opened, applause rose and disappeared. Phil laughed at something someone said, but his eyes kept drifting toward the stage. A band waited in the shadows, ready to play winners down the aisle. Everything felt controlled. Too controlled. Like the evening had been polished until no real feeling could get through. Then came the moment no one expected. The host joked about the impossible number of legends in the room. The crowd laughed. The band began a soft groove, just a fragment meant to fill a few seconds of television air. Phil recognized the rhythm before he recognized the danger in it. Loose, familiar, celebratory. Not quite his song, not quite Michael's. Open enough for trouble. Michael smiled. It was a tiny smile, almost private. Then he turned his head toward Phil. At first, Phil thought he had misunderstood. Maybe Michael was looking past him. But then Michael lifted one hand slightly, the smallest invitation, and the room seemed to tighten around that gesture. A producer near the stage stiffened. Someone in a headset leaned forward as if trying to stop a train with their eyes. Phil laughed once under his breath, not because it was funny, because it was impossible. There was no rehearsal, no key agreed upon, no arrangement, no safe little chart waiting on a stand. Just Michael Jackson, in the middle of an awards ceremony, silently asking Phil Collins to step into a song with him, in front of the most unforgiving audience in show business. And that is where the night found its heartbeat. Phil stood up slowly, almost as if his body had decided before his mind could object. He adjusted his jacket and stepped into the aisle. For a few seconds, the applause was confused. People did not know whether they were watching a joke, a mistake, or the beginning of something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Michael walked toward the stage from the other side, calm as moonlight. Phil moved differently, half shy, half daring, like a man walking into a storm because somebody had just dared him to be alive. Years later, people would argue about what made that moment feel so electric. Some would say it was the contrast. Michael, precise and mysterious. Phil, earthy, direct, warm, emotionally exposed. Some would say it was the shock of seeing two different kinds of fame meet without warning. But the truth was simpler. For one brief moment, the machine broke, and two musicians had to trust each other. That became the central truth of the night. Sometimes the most unforgettable performance is not the one you rehearse. It is the one that catches you before you can hide. The first notes were rougher than television usually allowed. Not bad, not wrong, just real. The band searched for the pocket. The drummer looked toward Phil almost instinctively, as if asking permission. Phil gave him a tiny nod. Michael stepped to the microphone first, letting out a line so clean and light that the room instantly quieted. Then Phil took the next line. His voice came in warmer, heavier, a little grainier around the edges. The contrast made people sit forward. It was like polished glass next to old wood. Michael's phrasing floated above the beat. Phil leaned into it like he was pushing a door open with his shoulder. The audience felt the difference immediately. That was why the atmosphere changed. It was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It was alive. The celebrities stopped acting like celebrities. Shoulders dropped. Smiles became real. Some clapped too early. Some laughed in disbelief. A few stood up before anyone told them it was acceptable. The room seemed to remember that before music became an industry, it was a spark passed from one person to another. But inside Phil, something else was happening. He had spent so much of his career being underestimated in strange ways. After Peter Gabriel left Genesis, many thought the band had lost its face. Phil stepped out from behind the drums and carried the microphone like it weighed more than any cymbal stand. Later, when his songs became enormous, people heard the hooks but did not always hear the loneliness. Standing beside Michael Jackson, Phil felt those rooms return. The rehearsal rooms, the hotel rooms, the silent drives after arguments at home. The hours when he wondered whether being everywhere for everyone meant being absent from the people who mattered most. And yet here he was, not hiding behind a drum kit, not playing the funny bloke at the awards table, not explaining himself to anyone. He was singing because the moment had asked him to sing. Michael turned toward him during the next phrase. It was not theatrical. It was musician to musician, a look that said, "Stay with me." Phil answered with rhythm more than words. He clapped once on the backbeat, then twice, pulling the audience with him. The band found its shape. The bass settled. The room began to move. Somewhere near the front, a famous actor laughed out loud, not because anything was amusing, but because the pressure had finally cracked and joy had come through. That was when the performance stopped feeling like a surprise and started feeling like an event. For Michael, the stage was a place of impossible control. Every turn and pause carried myth. But that night, even he looked lighter. No massive set, no perfect choreography, just a microphone and a room that had suddenly become human. Phil did not compete with Michael. He did what great musicians do when they are listening. He made space. And because he made space, the room got bigger. The songs stretched longer than planned. Producers made helpless little gestures. Television timing was sacred, and this moment was destroying it beautifully. One person pointed at a watch. Another shook his head, smiling to spite himself. Because how do you interrupt Michael Jackson and Phil Collins when an entire room has forgotten it is being broadcast? Phil caught the chaos from the corner of his eye and grinned. It was the old Genesis grin. The grin of the drummer who knew that sometimes the accident is where the magic lives. He pushed the chorus with a rasp that made the room answer back. Michael danced a half-step, almost casually, and the place erupted. Not polite award show applause, real noise.
the kind that rises from the chest before manners can stop it. Still, beneath the excitement, there was something tender about it. Phil had always understood that music could save a room, because it had once saved him in smaller, lonelier places, in empty houses, in studios after midnight, in the strange quiet after a marriage changes shape. That is why his voice sounded different that night. He was not just having fun. He was remembering what music had done for him when there was no room full of famous people watching. Near the end, Michael stepped back from the microphone and let Phil carry a line alone. Suddenly, the room heard Phil without the spectacle around him. Just that plain, wounded, unmistakable voice. The applause began before the line was finished. Phil looked down for a second, almost embarrassed by it. Then Michael reached out and touched his shoulder. Not a grand embrace, just a small acknowledgement from one performer to another. You were here. You met the moment. And for Phil Collins, that may have mattered more than the applause. When the song finally ended, the room did not settle immediately. It buzzed with the kind of disbelief that comes after something unscripted becomes the only thing anyone wants to talk about. People stood. Some laughed. Some clapped above their heads. Others stared at the stage, waiting for proof that it had really happened. The orchestra tried to return to the ceremony's normal rhythm, but the ceremony had changed. The polished evening had been cracked open, and something warm had escaped. Phil stepped away first. Michael gave a small bow, then turned toward him with that shy, brilliant smile. For a second, they were not icons. They were two men who had just survived a beautiful risk in public. Phil leaned close and said something no camera could clearly catch. Michael laughed. It was brief, human, almost ordinary. And maybe that was why it felt unforgettable. Back at his seat, Phil tried to disappear into the applause. He smiled, shrugged, and made it look like nothing. But the people near him knew better. His face carried that strange afterglow performers know well. Relief mixed with adrenaline, joy mixed with vulnerability. The feeling of having stepped off a cliff and discovered, halfway down, that the air would hold you. Later that night, in some private corner away from cameras, he may have replayed it in his head. The look from Michael, the first uncertain notes, the way the room changed, the shoulder touch, the applause that came before he could protect himself from it. Phil had played stadiums where the sound rolled back like thunder. But this was different. This was not about size. It was about surprise. It was about being asked, without warning, to trust the musician inside himself. That is why the story matters. Not because it was perfect, not because it changed the charts or became part of a carefully marketed era. It matters because it revealed something essential about Phil Collins. Under the success, the jokes, the easy smile, and the songs people still play at weddings, funerals, reunions, and lonely nights, he remained a man who responded to music like a call from across the room. Sometimes the most unforgettable performance is not the one you rehearse. It is the one that catches you before you can hide. That line followed the evening like an echo. Michael Jackson represented a kind of perfection that seemed almost unreal. Phil Collins represented something closer to the kitchen table, the empty bedroom, the drive home after bad news, the stubborn rhythm that keeps a person going when dignity is all he has left. Together, for a few unplanned minutes, they gave the audience both things at once: wonder and warmth, mystery and plain truth. And for older fans watching years later, That is what makes the memory ache a little, because by then they know what time does. Voices change, bodies fail, friends disappear, marriages end, heroes become complicated.
A song that once played in the background of an ordinary day can suddenly bring back an entire decade. Phil's career was filled with moments people can name. The drum break in the Air Tonight, the rise of Genesis after Peter Gabriel, the heartbreak of Face Value, the later years when his body made drumming painful and his son carried the beat beside him. Those moments are part of the public record. But stories like this live somewhere else. They live in the emotional record, in the half-remembered gasp of a crowd, in the smile between two artists, in the feeling that, for once, the evening had become more honest than anyone intended. Maybe that is what Phil Collins always gave people at his best. Not perfection, recognition. He made listeners feel that sadness could have rhythm, that heartbreak could become a chorus, that an ordinary-looking man could step into an extraordinary room and still carry the voice of someone who knew what it meant to hurt. That night with Michael Jackson, he did not need to prove he belonged. The song proved it for him. And maybe that is why the imagined memory still feels powerful. Because every life has a moment like that, a moment we did not plan for, a moment that turns toward us from across the room and asks us to stand up before we are ready. Phil stood up. Michael smiled. The music began. And for a few impossible minutes, the room did not belong to fame, television, or the machinery of show business. It belonged to trust. It belonged to nerve. It belonged to two voices reminding everyone that music is most alive when it can still surprise the people making it. If stories like this remind you why this music still matters, subscribe for more hidden stories from the legends who gave everything to the music.